Morning, Internet. Today is Thursday, thus a happy Thursday to you. Today, we want to just have a little brief discussion. By a brief discussion, and I mean I, want to talk briefly about sort of a phenomenon that I find in programming that can port to other disciplines in life. And the phenomenon is essentially um, going back going back to the basics, going back to what you know, going back to something that makes you feel good, going back to something that you're good at. Um, and so for me, the thing that got me thinking about this is, as I've talked about or referenced in previous videos, I'm doing coding bootcamp. It's generally pretty great. It's a full stack bootcamp, meaning you learn front end and back end. And the back end we're using Ruby and Ruby on Rails. So in a lot of ways, there's sort of been this steep learning curve. There's a huge amount of information every day, which is great and enjoyable in some ways, and in other ways it's terrible, miserable, and I'm just like not able to keep up with the pace as much as I'd like. Meaning that there's always like additional problems that I could do but I don't do. Sometimes I get stuck on concepts like I didn't get a lot of sleep when we were going over like databases, and so some like the database architecture I found really tough. That could be because of lack of sleep. That could be just like personal orientation, like lack of foundation, learning disability. Who knows? It's probably some combination of some of those things. But anyway, it felt really tough. Then, sort of where this is going is today and yesterday we started on a JavaScript a module. So sort of JavaScript is in the front end use for JavaScript. And it just felt great. It was exciting. It was fun. It was also very familiar. So so there's this sort of like mental effect that like I was like, okay, I got this. Like, okay, like this is somewhat familiar, and I was able to sort of, I imagine, get a mental edge just because I felt comfortable and I felt competent, and it was sort of like this self-fulfilling prophecy, or this like self-fulfilling prophecy is probably not the right word, but like self-fulfilling circumstance where I was like, okay, like I get the first problem right, and then I'm like super pumped because I got this first problem right, and then I get the second problem, and I like knock that out of the park, and then I have a certain amount of momentum, and at the end of the day, like I worked much more quickly through the JavaScript problems than I did on like the equivalent Ruby problems. Now, there may be a problem with that because maybe it's like an unfair advantage, maybe it's like there's a different depth or pace of learning, but I guess that's not the point that I'm trying to make. The point that I'm sort of interested in making and bringing up to the community is just like the sort of the strategy or the concept of sometimes taking a step back, boom, as I often literally do, as well as figuratively, and when you're getting really stuck or really frustrated, maybe it's maybe it's a good idea. I'm not sure why my English is so challenged at certain points in life. I know why my French is challenged, and I definitely know why my Mandarin is challenged. Like, that's pretty obvious, but my native language, who knows? In any case, I just think it's a useful strategy, and I've done this intentionally and non-intentionally for other things, but in life. But like going back to something and so like an example, it doesn't port exactly, but there's this one podcast that I really like listening to from Stanford. It's called the Stanford Thought Leaders Entrepreneurial Thought Leadership Series (ETL) with Tina Seelig, and there's just this one podcast that I'll sometimes go back to when I'm like really stressed, and it just like helps center me. Now this is slightly different, I guess, than like taking a pause when you're learning a program and going back to some topic in programming, if there are any, that you feel more comfortable with. But it's sort of similar, just the idea of a reset, and I think the idea of like sort of momentum and self-care and kindness and a certain level of like self-awareness in programming or in LTC, learning to code, is really useful. So that's essentially what I wanted to say. In summary, or in a attempt of summary. Today I wanted to bring up the idea of sort of the strategy or phenomenon of going back to what you know, going back to something that's familiar to you, particularly in the area of code, and using that as a not necessarily a reset strategy, but as a strategy to sort of take a break from some of the really tough, chewy, hard topics that might hurt your head for a while or potentially forever. I know that when I was able to do this, sort of with the transition from Ruby to databases to then JavaScript, having studied a little bit of JavaScript before I started this full stack program, was really, really useful. So, in conclusion, I would love to know, as often is the case, if not always the case, what you think about this video, the format, what we could do better, what if anything, we're doing well, and also just sort of like the more broad topic about, I guess, either the phenomenon of going back to something familiar, the sort of the meta concept of taking an intention and resetting through something that you know, or just the idea of self-care and sort of like more global strategy or operational strategy, or when LTC, so learning to code. With that, I'm going to go to class or do a homework set. I'm not sure what I'm going to do today, but I hope you have a great day or a great night, or a terrible day if that's what you want. If you want to have a terrible day, I hope you do that, because I'm not the boss of you. I'm barely the boss of me, and I've had many bosses, so I kind of know what I'm talking about, except clearly I don't. So you chew on that, and I'll catch you again next time. Cheers.